So as we talk about data visualization, I think it's useful to have a conversation about infographics, both as sort of a review of something that's widely used as a data visualization strategy, but also to revisit some of the things that we've talked about in terms of good graphic design and data visualization, and things that are maybe not so good. So quickly, an infographic is a mix of text or images, charts, maps, so that we organize in what we hope is a visually appealing way. And the idea is that we're going to be able to communicate a message that has multiple parts and do so clearly in a way that the viewer and the consumer can sort of interpret and read. And there's lots of programs that will use or that will generate infographics. You could use Canva or Visimi or Tableau Public. I tend to work with paint.net, which is kind of like Photoshop, where I can sort of add elements in and build them myself. But that's not necessarily the most user-friendly, and there are very user-friendly software packages out there that you can use to do this. That even been said, it is really easy to do this poorly, and I would encourage you to not just sort of throw this together, but to actually give it some thought about what you're doing and how to do it effectively. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about an infographic that I found that I think does some things well and does some things poorly, and kind of run through kind of my takedown of this. And this is something that was developed by the U.S. Office of Personnel Management to kind of highlight the story of women working in the federal government. And one thing that this infographic does really well is it tells you that right off the bat with a descriptive title. And the title is at the top where you'd expect to find it, and it's visually engaging. There's different fonts going on, there's italices, and there's different colors, and it's a large enough block of text that your eye goes there sort of instantly. And so it's a good example of the principle of hierarchy, that the first place that you look should give you the first piece of information that you need to be able to make sense of this infographic. So women in federal service are seated at every table. That's what this is about. It's telling us about women in federal service. Another thing that I like about this infographic is that it uses supporting text elements. So one of the things that we oftentimes neglect with data visualization is that we try to put everything into pictures, and we forget that sometimes just really descriptive text presented in a visually appealing way and in a small sort of packet or nugget can be very powerful. And so I like that this adds in some quotes from people associated with the Office of Personnel Management, talking about what they're doing and what they're working on, and those are placed in a way that I think a person who's interested in studying this infographic will find useful. Another useful thing in this infographic is that there are subtitles. Again, using that principle of hierarchy, that our second place we should look should be directed, and we should know what we're looking at, and it should track our eye to different sections of the visual. And so we have these short subtitles that show us different sections where information is being presented, and organizes the story in a way that I think you would read fairly closely. You'd probably start at the top, and then you'd probably zip over to the leadership sort of block, and then you probably go to the workplace flexibilities block, and then you jump down to the closing the pay gap block. And I think that more or less tracks with how people would read and process that information. And we can control that because of how we've set up the format and cued people with the information. Chart elements. Different chart elements help to keep people's attention. The pie charts are looking at the contrast of leadership in the public sector versus the private sector. Maybe that's an interesting story to tell. I could quickly pick out from that if we're looking at the private sector, you only have about 14% of women in top leadership positions, but it's more than double that in the federal service. So that's interesting, and I can pick that out quickly. I pivot over, I'm looking at the bar charts, and I'm looking at a comparison of men and women. And job satisfaction in a couple different dimensions, and so that's interesting. Like I can fairly quickly pick out that information, and that the graphics are effective there. There's other places where this doesn't work so well, and so one thing that I did like is that they're using these sort of pictures, these icons, to help contextualize the stats, right? And so if we're looking at that bar chart, there's sort of the little computer with the home, and I don't know exactly what that is, but when I look down and see it's telework, I'm like, oh, of course. And then I see the buggy, and like, I bet that has something to do with kids. And I see the clock and the calendar, I bet that has something to do with like scheduling flexibility, right? So I can see quickly what those bars are referencing based on the picture. Like that, that's great. What's not so great is that they then try to use those icons in place of bar charts. And so anytime you do that, you end up sort of distorting your sense of scale. The picture isn't always obvious, and particularly that second one where it's the dollar bill coming out from, I think, like a machine, maybe like a cash dispenser. But what they're trying to communicate is that the further out the dollar is from the cash dispenser, that's like a bar chart. That's communicating like the 70 cents versus the 87 cents. That is not intuitive to me. I'm guessing it's not intuitive to a lot of people. It's really hard to do pictures as bar charts and to do it well. And it's not always easy to know exactly what a picture is communicating, particularly when you start distorting them in abstract ways or trying to use them as bar charts and take them out of their sort of larger context. Okay, in general, I think the design of this is pretty good. We've got a bunch of sans serif fonts throughout, which is good for electronic reading. There is one main font, but then there's some accent elements. So you get this main sort of sans serif font, but at times it's sort of made italicized. Sometimes it's all caps, and sometimes it's sort of normal sentence case. The color scheme, I'm not a huge fan of the colors, but for the most part, it works. It's not, you know, a rainbow. There's a handful of colors. There's a strong accent color. What I'm not so thrilled about is the contrast between the two blues in the bar charts, particularly if, when I'll talk about this in a little bit, that's maybe not the best for accessibility and the ability for people who have vision issues to pick out the difference. But I think what really gets to me about the design of this thing is that it feels cluttered, that because there's all these textures in the background and all these colors in the background, it ends up feeling a little cluttered to me. And I wonder if it might feel less cluttered if we reduced some of the color and allowed some more white space into that graphic. And then lastly, I'm going to really pound this idea of accessibility, because I think that this infographic has some real issues there. So there are a number of places where the font size is pretty small, and it's going to be hard for somebody with visual impairment to read. Again, I mentioned the contrast between the light blue and the dark blue is not as strong a contrast as you would want for somebody with some visual impairment. That's potentially a problem. Also, if you're putting text in images, in general, that's problematic for folks who are using text readers, because the text reader hits the image and it doesn't know what's there. And if the image is doing a lot of work and communicating a lot of information, as is often the case with infographics, anybody who is forced to use a text reader, who is using a text reader, is going to be completely at a loss what you're focusing on. And so there is a accessibility solution to that, which is to include in your graphic an alt text. So if you're building web pages, this is oftentimes something where when you upload a graphic, you can add in alt text. And this is just sometimes a very short description where you say, this is a picture of my cat. Or you say, okay, this is an infographic about women in the federal service, and we're trying to communicate that women in the private sector are a fairly small percentage, but 34% of leaders in the government sector are women, right? Spell it out, communicate to folks in your alt text what's happening in that infographic so that they can listen to that and be like, oh, okay, I got it. Like, I know what that picture was supposed to be doing. Now, the secret on this is, if you're able to write really clear and effective alt text, that's the starting point for design. That's the story you want to tell. If it's not in your alt text, you probably don't need a graphic showing it, right? And so I would maybe encourage folks to start data visualization in general, whether we're thinking about infographics or not, with a 1 or 2 sentence, what's your alt text for that graphic going to be? Summarize what it is, summarize what the takeaway is, and then make a graphic that illustrates that. And I think if you do that, you're going to keep the story front and center, and you're less likely to do things that are unnecessary. You're less likely to bury the important story in your graphic, and you're not going to get sort of sidetracked by adding in things that don't need to be there. And so I think it's always a good idea to start with that alt text.